like to welcome each of you to this virtual space where we connect people from social movements, academia, the arts, and people of social media who wish to be part of a collective construction of knowledge and social transformation. Let me briefly introduce the research project we are initiating here at Boston College, thus giving continuity to previous stages developed in Mexico, together with colleagues from Latin America and the Caribbean. We now wish to extend and deepen the links with the north of the continent to think together from Alaska to Patagonia, how to confront and overcome the global violence that afflicts us. We would also like to extend our links with other regions of the planet later, always from the perspective of the invisible persons and peoples. Decolonial thinking, or descolonial, as I prefer to mention, descolonial thought has been weaving networks of knowledge and action for more than 3 decades between social movements that confront violence and academic communities, artists, communicators, civil society organizations, and churches that, assuming a decolonial way of life and thought, wish to contribute to the gestation of another possible world. In this way, each of us participants here, with our own way of being and knowing in a global process from below, rooted in our diversity of cultures and territory, we are gathered today. ¿Qué entendemos por pensamiento descolonial?
What do we understand by decolonial or descolonial thought from Boston College here? Here we understand descolonial thought in continuity with and innovating on critical thought, which from the past century alerted us against instrumental modernity. We take on the contributions of postmodern phenomenology, as well as critical theory, and especially political philosophy, but also liberation theology from half a century ago, and queer theology in more recent times. Thinking in order to transform and transforming from places of social activism to think in another way, always from the subjectivities, that is, female bodies and territories that are negated by the hegemonic world, so that we all may elaborate knowledges that promote dignified life with justice, memory, equity, and truth, within a horizon of remembering dismembered bodies of humanity and of our sister, Mother Earth. Systemic violence has concrete names that descolonial thought says and analyzes with rigor: patriarchy, colonialism, extractivist capitalism, and white supremacist racism. From our perspective, we have to include a fifth axis, that is sacrificial religion, which goes through the whole structure of the world system that every day builds more walls to protect the hegemonic minorities, always sacrificing more and more human beings and other creatures that live in our common house to benefit the privilege of the minority. We find ourselves in a time of global storms, a long night, as the Maya people would say, a society of dystopias that, again, every day build more walls. Nevertheless, when we attentively look at the world, we can appreciate that in these walls there are cracks and fissures, and it is there in the zone of non-being, as Franz Fanon mentions, in this dark side of democracy, as Achille Mbembe calls it, This is where life flourishes, where windows and passages are opened thanks to the resistances of survivors. When the subaltern speak, as Spivak says, this wall is disintegrated. And it is through these cracks that life arises as an ethical and political indignation, as a caress that gives body and heals, and as a spirituality of resistance given fatal power. This is also the direction of this research project that we are beginning today in Boston College, to continue strengthening resistances to global violence that come from these zones of non-being in the South and in the global North. With the potency of the poor and the excluded that organize themselves, from women and people on paths of forced migration that become indignant, and from our sister, Mother Earth, who also suffers these violences and develops resistance. There are signs of hope that it's important to know how to read, investigate, give potency to, and to celebrate as gifts of life and as ethical, political, and spiritual commitments. So allow me to introduce you to our invited people today. This first seedbed, as these kinds of conversations are called by our Zapatista companions, coming from the southeast of Mexico. These semilleros, the seedbed, should be a space and a time to cultivate hope for a world where many worlds fit. Before giving space to our three invited people today, I'd like to invite Matt to, in general, greet the people from social movements that are with us today.
Well, thank you, Carlos, for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful new initiative. So for those who don't know me, my name is Matt Cuff. I'm currently completing my Master's of Theological Studies degree at Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry. When Carlos first mentioned this project to me, I was very excited. Prior to my graduate studies, I served as a senior policy advisor in the Jesuits' Office of Justice and Ecology in Washington, D.C. There, I engaged in advocacy, education, and networking on the social justice priorities of the Society of Jesus. Methodologically, my office was committed to learning directly from social movements in impacted communities. And we tried to invite those communities to Washington to engage in advocacy directly with decision makers. This work taught me two very simple yet profound truths that I think are relevant for this initiative and the type of descolonial theology that Carlos so wonderfully articulated. First, I would say there is a hierarchy to knowing social justice issues and injustice in particular. So what do I mean by this? My colleagues and I may have known the history behind a social issue and the current policy solutions being proposed, but our knowledge was only ever surface level unless we took time to know deeply and personally the communities and movements that actually experience those issues. My knowledge was important, but for it to be effective in a full knowledge, it needed to be knowledge understood in community. Second, by prioritizing relationships with social movements and communities directly impacted, our work here can take on an appropriate humility. So what do I mean by humility? Professional advocates, and dare I say it, even academics, can and often do fall into the trap of ascribing too much to their work, too much ability to transform, too much knowledge of an issue, and perhaps too much self-importance. Social movements, by contrast, keep those of us in these positions humble and honest. Understood properly, us academics and advocates, we're not saviors or even really leaders. We are supporters and at best door openers, called to friendship and mutuality with social movements. Put simply, social movements guide us and offer us insights into the reality of things as they are. They are subjects of their own transformation, and those of us here are called to stand with them in solidarity. So with that in mind, it's my pleasure on behalf of this initiative to invite all of those social movements and activists here today, and those who will watch this recording in the weeks and months to come, to this space and to let you know that this is your space, that this is your classroom, this is your seminar, and we are your students. So welcome.
Gracias, Matt. Iniciamos pues con las resistencias en Puerto Rico, gracias a la presencia de las compañeras Zoan Dávila y Shariana Ferrer, de la colectiva feminista en construcción, y de Nelson Maldonado Torres, de la Fundación Frantz Fanon. Para nosotros aquí, ustedes tres, Zoan, Shariana, Nelson, son sabedoras y sabedor, no expertas, tampoco activistas y profesor. Sus saberes adquieren muchas formas y deseamos aprender de ustedes, intercambiar experiencias e ideas con ustedes, alumbrar juntos intuiciones y cultivar un campo común de conocimiento y transformación social. Comenzar con Puerto Rico es una feliz coincidencia porque nos rememora un encuentro con el pueblo boricua migrante que cambió la vida de Iván Illich en el Bronx de Nueva York hace más de medio siglo. Caminando con esas comunidades exiliadas, fue surgiendo el pensamiento de un autor crítico a la modernidad instrumental, que a su modo es también un ancestro del pensamiento crítico. Gracias también a ustedes, quienes se conectan en la nube virtual, pues cada uno somos expertos en humanidad. Quienes hoy tomarán la palabra y quienes estaremos a la escucha atenta, crítica y cordial. Iniciamos pues escuchando a Nelson Maldonado Torres, quien nos hablará sobre colonialismo, colonialidad y decolonialidad combativa. Adelante, Nelson, bienvenido.
Muchas gracias a Carlos y a todas las personas que han estado envueltas en la organización de este semillero que inauguramos hoy. Es un gran placer estar con ustedes.
Welcome, everybody. We're excited for this initiative that we're beginning today. And I'm happy to be here with my Boricua comrades, Shariana Ferrer and Zoan Davila, who work in this important experience on the island called the Feminista Collective Under Construction. And I'm struck that we're starting with the name of Ivan Illich. He was a great teacher, a mentor with whom I had the pleasure of working in the prison here in Puerto Rico. My mentor told me about Ivan Illich. And also stories of my dear colleagues Silvia Marcos in Cuernavaca, who's also very familiar with and knew Ivan Illich very closely in all of his work. I have some slides that I'm going to present in PowerPoint here. So I'll transition a little bit. I'll kind of come in and go out. And I'll start here, if you give me a second to put the correct image up. And I think it's this one. So if I'm correct, you're seeing an image, just an image by itself with the logo of our foundation, my name below it, right? And so I want to begin. I'm speaking Spanish. And I did this slide in English, thinking that because I was here on the other side of the Atlantic, I would. Anyway, I'll go in between.
I want to acknowledge that from where I am speaking up right now, and I am speaking from the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape. I stand in solidarity with Native American and indigenous peoples leading the movement of resurgence, decolonization, and reclamation of their homelands. These lands were stolen to create settler colonial states, and those who were dispossessed continue to live under conditions of siege, surveillance, and extractivist violence, it is critical to support land back and imperative arrest to all settlers and settler institutions, including state institutions and universities, which at the foundations were established on stolen indigenous land that were also shaped and cultivated by enslaved African peoples. I support the undying fight for Black liberation and its many manifestations here and across the planet. And I want to acknowledge that this is based on a statement by the, I think that I messed this up now, right? This statement is based on similar land acknowledgement statement by the International Imagination of Anti-National and Anti-Imperialist Feelings, which is based in New York City. And it's an umbrella organization that, among other things, is spearheading a strike against the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA. You can find more information on them online. On December 6 of 2021, the Frantz Fanon Foundation made public close to a dozen responses from organizations and individuals to its call for reflections on combative decoloniality. The call for a combative decoloniality emerged in the context of a rapid incorporation of decoloniality as a keyword in academic settings and the conversion of decoloniality into a trend. Surely, much is to be celebrated and potentially gained in attention to projects of decolonization and decolonial thought, and that refer to decolonial thought, yet decoloniality does not quite align with the scope and goals of the hegemonic liberal higher education, aka the modern Western research university. The process of invoking and engaging decoloniality in academia is therefore a complicated one where decoloniality could be mistranslated and absorbed by the ethos of traditional academic scholarship and pedagogy, as well as accommodated within a framework with liberal goals. The commodification of decoloniality is taking place in multiple forms, including in the quick rebranding of academics, multiple forms academic projects everywhere as decolonial happening different places across the world. And I want to read you the invitation that the Frantz Fanon Foundation made to these movements last year. This is how the invitation read. And the La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción is one of the organizations that received this call. The Frantz Fanon Foundation kindly requests your participation in an event that we are planning for December 6th, which marks the 60th anniversary year of Fanon's passing. This is also the year of the 60th anniversary of the publication of The Wretched of the Earth. Your participation will consist of a pre-recorded video of 2 to 4 minutes and so on, and these are the logistics. We return to the concept of combativity and to Fanon's reflections about it in a context where references to decoloniality have become pervasive in circles within the academy. While there is much to celebrate in attention to this topic, it is also clear that many are failing to realize its combative dimension, particularly as it relates to the decolonial imperative of generating and or working with collectives that are simultaneously pursuing material, symbolic, and epistemic decolonization. This effort was at the center of Fanon's praxis as a militant and as a knowledge creator, and it is at the center of the Frantz Fanon Foundation's work. And we started our event where we presented for the first time this kind of these responses, well, 12, almost a dozen of these responses with this quote that I'm going to share by projecting my screen again. We are all in the same boat. Everybody will be slaughtered or tortured. The collective struggle, le combat collectif, presupposes a collective responsibility from the rank and file and a collegial responsibility at the top. Yes, everyone must be involved in the struggle, le combat, for the sake of the common salvation, le salut commun. There are no clean hands, no innocent bystanders. We are all in the process of dirtying our hands in the quagmire of our soil and the terrifying void of our minds. Any bystander is a coward or a traitor. And the first response that we played was a beautiful, to this call, was a beautiful spoken word composition and performance from Dudusile Matonzi, who forms part of the Black House Collective, a Black conscious and Pan-African community and activist organization based in Soweto, occupied Azania, otherwise known as South Africa. The spoken word piece was followed by an offering from the Strike MoMA group of the already mentioned IIAAF, highlighting the value of and commitment with international solidarity. So I will quickly play both now.
A deadly disease has scorched us, the condemned chained, traditions wiped out, native language substituted. Scared and ill, the little spirit left, I shout combat. Fear still holds us down. My undying spirit shall go on in combat. I look at what has come of us. Shame clouds me. However, I fear not, as Fanon said. Shame is a revolutionary sentiment. I smile as I recall his words. It is a work in progress. Fourth industrial revolution, changing world order. I still shout, are you blind? The two compartments of the colonial world are still expanding. The dividing line has grown thicker. A world without spaciousness. Men live on top of the other. A hungry town, starved of bread, starved of meat, starved of life, and starved of light. The new world order emerging, the condemned chained, still on our knees. The children of Azania are torn in two parts. Double consciousness outweighs us. A friendly reminder, a call for action in combat. We shout. No matter how well the Black subject has mastered the culture and language of whiteness, her body remains Black. Aluta continua to Farnon's decolonial spirit of combativity. Aluta continua to the unfinished project of decolonization. Ignited, truth unraveled, mist of darkness now faded. Such a timeless gift bestowed upon us. Aluta continua. The struggle against colonialism still continues. 21st century, digital era, westernization, Western culture is our colonizer, media the deliverer. I write what I like. I am Duduzile Nonkosi Matonzi, 22 years of age. I am a member of the Black House Collective in Soweto. Thank you. Aluta continua. Aluta continua to Farnon's spirit of combativity. Aluta continua to the spirit of decoloniality. The struggle continues.
That's a quote from Fanon's work. La colectiva feminista en construcción also joined us in this occasion, and we will show their video, their response to our call for thinking about the combative decoloniality in the transition between my presentation and the presentation of our colleagues from La Colectiva. But first, I'd like to make a few points, just 3 quick points, and raise a number of questions about narratives of resistance, the theme, narratives of resistance and systemic violence, from what I think would be could be considered a combative point of view or within the scope of combative decoloniality. The first point is that it's an invitation to think through this series through this entire semillero, these various events, these various panels. And an invitation to think not only about narratives of resistance, but also about narratives, practices, and knowledges of re-existence. The Colombian decolonial thinker and artist, Adolfo Alban, who is an author of a book entitled Prácticas Creativas de Reexistencia, Más allá del arte, el mundo de lo sensible, proposed this category of resistance a number of years ago. The category is also key in the work of figures such as Catherine Walsh and the Afro-Ecuadorian intellectual and activist Edison León, who recently published a book entitled Filosofía de las Existencias, desde el cimarronaje. The category of existence and re-existence invites engagement with phenomenology, with Africana phenomenology. Think of Luis Gordon, for example, his text Existencia Africana, among many other writings. Existence means to come out, to come forth. And so the notion is that re-existence can be taken as a combative category because it points to sites of emergence towards the creation of something new. And it refers to individuals and groups emerging without necessarily responding immediately to the power that is pressuring them. And in that sense, that is somewhat different from resistance, which is of course also very valuable. The second point is the relevance of having Puerto Rico in this context that includes participants from the unceded but corporated territories of the United States, that is the 50 states, and the also unceded and incorporated territories of Latin American proto-states and states. Puerto Rico is often missed from American studies, even though it is a territory of the US, and from Latin American studies because it is not an independent Spanish-speaking republic. It is also sometimes ignored by students of decoloniality, even though Puerto Rico is not only an example of the severe coloniality that has profoundly marked the Caribbean since its inception, but also a colony, an actual contemporary colony. Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory of the US, and everyone who is born in Puerto Rico receives what Malcolm X would have probably called a second-class or worse citizenship. As a result, Puerto Ricans do not need passports to come to the unceded but corporated states. And there is something about being, this is what I'm pointing to. There is something about at least we are not corporated. At least the unincorporation may have an edge. Right? And there are more Puerto Ricans living in the unceded and corporated states than in the Puerto Rican archipelago. Third point is this apparent anomaly of Puerto Rico in the Americas, which contributes to its erasure, also makes Puerto Rico a site of possibility, neither fully belonging to the US or to Latin America, really belonging more than anything to the Caribbean, but also maintaining close ties to both US and Latin America. Puerto Rico offers a rich horizon of possibility to combative decolonial movements. These movements can take from as well as combine lessons from anti-racist and anti-colonial movements from the US and from different places of Latin America, as well as the Caribbean. We're not constrained in that sense. Our horizon, our vision immediately pushes in multiple directions at the same time, drawing from US Black and decolonial feminism, as well as from Latin American and Caribbean anti-colonial and decolonial movements and thought. La colectiva feminista en construcción has become a major contributor to decolonial thinking and action, not only in Puerto Rico, but in the entire hemisphere. They exemplify this, what I'm building on, taking advantage and expanding this possibility that is there in Puerto Rico. That is also in different ways in different places. I'm highlighting how crucial, how important it is and that it exists in Puerto Rico. I am privileged to be in dialogue with La Cole, finding connections and intersections that can help to advance their goals, as well as to decolonize the academy, as well as the presumed expertise of scholars of decoloniality. They are impressive agents of social and epistemic change, as well as teachers, and I am proud to be in this panel with them today, which is for me an opportunity for continuous growth, and both on learning and learning from them. And so I meant this to serve as a kind also explanation of what we are up to at the Franz Fanon Foundation with the call for a combative decoloniality, but also as an entry into our colleagues now. And for this, we're going to go directly into the response to our call, to the video, and then immediately to happen. So let me just end with that.
desde sus centros de trabajo, desde sus comunidades, desde otros lugares, también están construyendo país. Y ese es el país que sí es posible. Ese es el país que sí yo merece. Convoquemos, compañeras, compañeras y compañeros. Convoquemos, movilicemos y hagamos nuestra esta lucha. Esta lucha es de quien ponga el cuerpo en la calle y organice. Así que de aquí salimos de la emergencia a lo que emerge, de la emergencia a lo que sale de abajo y recorre, de la emergencia a lo que sí es posible. Y si estamos hartas, de verdad, si estamos hartas de las maneras en las que nos tratan, si estamos hartas de las maneras en las que nos acosan, que nos agreden, que nos abusan, si realmente estamos hartas, pues sí, vamos a quemar el cielo si es preciso.
Gracias por su atención. Y ahora escuchemos a la
Thank you for your attention. I'll leave the space to my companions. Hi. I'm a little, after seeing this video and remembering all of, I don't know, it's touching to me. As being here on a screen, speaking a little slowly. So I don't know, I'm trying to concentrate. I'm trying to center myself and to be here with you all, sharing with you. So first, I want to thank you for this invitation. I want to thank Carlos and the rest of the companions at Boston College, and to Nelson also for always, being a bridge in these conversations and uniting different proposals and different goals. So I want to take advantage of this time and the space here to speak from our work and the possibility of finding ourselves with other people. I want to share with you in this first part I'm just trying to organize what I'm sharing today. A little bit to do this exercise of situating ourselves. A lot of our work in our collective has been about realizing that decolonization, descolonization is not a metaphor. It's not like other projects or hopes that name and establish what a utopia is. For us, descolonization is not an unachievable phenomenon. It's not only a viable project, but an urgent project. It's not an abstract project. It's tangible and material. It's not a future project. It's a catalyst of present realities. So in this video that you just saw, the insistence of what you saw about articulating our project from here and from now. In the Puerto Rican context, similar to what happens in the Global South, our lands are taken from us, the land that we walk on is taken from us, and our own lives are taken. They kill us in the most material ways, or they live us without a possible way of living. And this is why descolonization can't be reduced to letters or academic journals or papers, or even thinking about descolonization as a cultural crutch, or rather as a way only of generating art and creation from an aesthetic point of view, but rather it has to have its feet on the ground. Descolonization is not only an ideal, like something that you just think about and talk about and just argue about. Descolonization requires strategies and forms. There are tactics and direct actions. It requires organization and it requires politics because we're talking about power. And in our organization, this part of what brings us together is thinking that thinking about descolonization in order to be able to build power. And so having said that, I wanted to center and speak about this idea of Puerto Rican exceptionalism and add on to what Nelson was saying about our Caribbean collective identity and looking at us between points of the global South. Something that we've had to really work through and something that's been part of the work of our collective is to think about how this huge problem that we're responding to and building resistance against is part of a logic of time. It's a logic of time that's imposed on a colonial modern project. And so Fanon himself said that the project that we're working on here is a time logic. So if we look closely, what time has to do with our problem? Soan, my companion, and I have talked a little bit before this about how one of the problems throughout time and that goes through time is race as a generator of difference has three different stages that all operate together. So one is recognizing a colonial past where this racial discourse is inserted in order to capture, kidnap, and exploit our peoples. Then later in this stage of colonization of the Caribbean and the Americas, but this also happens in the present under modernity in civilizing discourse that's manifested in a racialized state and anti-Black violence that reproduces these logics from the plantation to the modern state. And race operates in the past and in the present. We also see that race operates in the future, in this time that doesn't exist or the promise of a time in the future, because race also operates under a logic of debt and indebtedness. And so it captures the possible future. And this has to do with the work that we've been doing in the collective and in our Puerto Rican context where debt and the narrative of debt as an extension of a colonial project of this world system where race is imposed for capturing bodies, futures, and peoples. We see this topic of debt as something very close to our work. And the work that we've been doing, part of it is to recognize and to grasp this idea of emergency as something that isn't just something, it's not just something we're going to re-signify as emergence, but the critical state of anti-Black violence, patriarchal violence, homophobic violence, capitalistic colonial violence that is lived in a particular space in Puerto Rico. This is a violence that is lived and that materializes, especially after something like the Hurricane Maria, earthquakes that we suffer in 2020. We see also the ways in which these emergencies and these states of crises are made more acute, but it's like, for who are they made more acute? These crises are made present for whom? Who are the bodies, who are the peoples, who are the populations that feel and live this emergency? It would seem like, and this is something that we know, that it's for Black and poor people. This state of emergency is a constant state. And so that's how we've tried to use emergency as a vehicle that makes possible and makes visible, makes the state visible. This racial, patriarchal, colonial state that we point to so much, that our narratives name as the system, but that it's always uncapturable. We can't totally describe it. It's our pain. This is our kind of we attribute our economic problems to the state, but it's always distant. It's always, the state is always marked by something that we can't name, we can't capture it, because the government is seen through its public officials and its processes, its electoral and administrative processes. But when we name and speak about the system is never present. It's not a material structure. So this is a little bit about politically what we mean when we are trying to signify the state. It's about trying to understand what we're naming when we say the system. And that's how we see this need of talking about a state of emergency, that naming and configuring the state, who's the subject? So there we see the dispute between those of us subjects that receive violence, gender-based violence, and those of us who are exposed to that kind of violence, but contrary to a subject who is incarnated, and this is the subject of the state who exercises the violence. This is the state of emergency. And the last thing I wanted to name before passing space to my companion Son is to name a little bit political exercises and specific campaigns where we've played with this naming and making visible the state. So our organization and the political work that we've done during these last 7 going on 8 years is that we've always tried to get out a little bit of the boundaries, the capture of the modern colonial project that keeps getting repeated. So we try to get out of this coloniality of the struggle, where we are opposed to something, and in this exercise of opposing ourselves and denouncing oppression, we end up reproducing the same logics of this oppression. And that's this exercise of naming and making us conscious of coloniality. And so to give you an example of our organization, our political organization, as a way of escaping this, and this is why we call ourselves a collective under construction, both constructing outside, but also constructing inside, is because our organization we try to be uncapturable. Because feminist organizations that we've been related to and debating with and collaborating with, and also in confrontation with, these regular feminist organizations have mostly been organizations that practice and talk about a bourgeois white feminism. And our organization doesn't fit in that logic. Our organization is an anti-racist organization that, in difference to other anti-racist projects in Puerto Rico, our exercise of affirmation of Blackness or cultural reproduction has some very particular signs of Blackness in Puerto Rico and in the Caribbean. It's not necessarily connected to an undoing of a racial a lot of them aren't connected to undoing a racial state, but we are committed to undoing and confronting white supremacy. And our organization is anti-colonial and descolonial, and we see independence as a strategy. And so we distance ourselves from independentist strategies because we don't want to be a sovereign racialized state in Puerto Rico. And we're also an anti-capitalist organization because many of the other organizations, many of us that form the collective come from communist socialist organizations. But in our collective, we recognize the difference between naming gender violence, homophobic violence, transphobic violence, and anti-Black violence as sub-themes of class struggle. We don't do that. So it's not a mix of struggles, but it's a way of positioning ourselves that emerges from a discourse and a long, radical tradition of Blackness, especially one that continues a long tradition of female Blackness from the Combahee River Collective. And our starting point is that our oppressions are interwoven. They are systems that are related to each other. And we center ourselves on the Black woman as the political revolutionary subject that will allow us to build another future life where it's not a future where this state of emergency and violence is present, but rather life emerges and flowers where we're not trying to escape violence and oppression, but we go out of ourselves to find ourselves with others, and where time is going to be something relative because we're not subordinate and dominated by these logics of past, present, and future. Rather, we will be able to simply live. How do we do this? How do we bet on this? Soan is going to name some of these examples of the dynamics of our political actives. Thank you. Excellent transition, Shariana. Perfect. So I'm also grateful for my invitation here, and a little bit not to lose the flow of what Shariana was talking about. I'm going to start right there. Just quickly, I think that something that I should share a little bit to give context is that for us in the collective, it's very important. And it's a central axis of the political work that we do is our own political formation. So this is something that we are very careful about because it's exactly through our own political formation and being able to understand things in a new way that we're able to struggle against, in the first place, the ways how we have been we've been prevented from having these other kinds of knowledges, and we've been blocked from making connections with other people in the Caribbean and in Latin America and of the Black tradition that our work is rooted in. So in our search for these traditions and these reference points and these leaders and recovering these connections, it's been important for us to have the work of Stuart Hall. And this is a call, politics without a guarantee. This has been part of the methodology that we've adopted in our work, particularly in the last years. And I mention this as something extremely relevant because it's part of our history as an organization. Because when we speak about how our collective began and what Shariana means when she describes us as heading out, escaping, we have to understand that our collective comes about in 2014. And some of us were part of socialist organizations, independent organizations for independence, feminist organizations, where the systems of oppression or how we live and experience violence wasn't considered to be interwoven. They're seen as separate topics and themes. And in this sense, our question and our doubt, the doubt of those of us who were in these different places, was how can we do political work that recognizes that these things are interwoven? And so this is why we came together and we took on this call of Stuart Hall as a challenge of how to see how we can do a kind of work that on one side centers Black women, because part of the radical feminist Black tradition is how to do work that delights in and considers how to fight against capitalism as a colony. These were the two things. So we, responding to this call and looking around and seeing how we can start deciding how to do political work, what we decided is that we just had to start. We had to do something that wouldn't necessarily be so clear about seeing concrete topics, but just starting, putting all our eggs in a basket and betting on what we could achieve as part of the process. And so being aware of our process, giving our process importance, because it's through these processes, and this is what we've seen in our work, that this popular power is cultivated, and this kind of power that is needed to overthrow this oppression. And so we did some experiments or some experiences of how we can have, on one side, a feminist movement that doesn't necessarily, and I'm talking about like 2016, 2017, that isn't necessarily a movement that's in the streets. And the first thing that we worked on, and the first thing that we organized, was a strike, a women's strike. And the first thing that we came up, and when we proposed this, the first thing we encountered was that to unions and to feminist organizations was that nobody thought this would be possible, that women could stop the country. They didn't think that we had the resources to stop the country, to strike. And so to be able to we highlighted the situation of crisis that our country lives in. And it's been a state like this forever, but in the last couple of years, we've really been talking about the topic of debt and the precarity of people living here. And so we proposed this strike, and nobody from any other organization, no other movement bet on it with us. But we decided to follow this call of politics without guarantee. And so we just started with this process and started cultivating this rage, as Fanon says. And surprisingly but happily, this women's strike was just the first of many activities that have become part of the feminist movement in our country, like vanguard feminist movements in our country. It's a discussion that really grew from this action. And we began to have more encounters, more links with other organizations in order to see more clearly, okay, the problem of gender-based violence is not unconnected in any way from anti-Black violence that we also live here in our country. And so these connections, this was one of the discussions that we could start having based on this action that we did. And so for us, it was a learning process, because in the first place, we realized that using other tactics that aren't the tactics that everyone thinks are appropriate, these are the tactics that we can start dismantling the system with and that we can use to struggle against colonialism. But when we saw how using these tactics, we could generate discussion and we could defend our country. And so we kind of went beyond what is recognized as struggle. And in the last place, we saw the importance of adopting in our methodology direct confrontation against the state as the place that we want to resist, because environmental racism, gender violence, inequality, all of these are promoted by the state. So we realized the importance of being able to adopt within our methodology direct confrontation, and that's been part of how we have marked our understanding of the system and understanding how the state reproduces its own logic and how the state supports the capitalist system. So another one of the tools that we've used to promote our work, and that is outside of the framework of what's understood as struggle, is to be able to, in the process, create new meanings and within our discourse that allows us, again, to
delatar, ¿verdad?, cómo funciona ese sistema.
That allow us to point out how the system works and to have a different kind of discussion about how we eradicate these systems of oppression so that it doesn't feel so far away from the people. And so one of the first examples about one of these projects that we've done to subvert these logics. And I think that it began with the topic of debt, because when we started, we've always talked about this debt crisis, but in the last couple of years, the crisis has been the debt crisis. And people said to us, well, we have to cooperate, we have to pay our debt. This is a problem for all of us have to contribute. But the discussion about how the debt was generated, where it came from, who was responsible for this, that has been circumscribed, that only lawyers can understand it, only economists, only specialists. But these discussions are far away from the people who live the repercussions of this debt. So part of our work exactly has been to challenge the discourse so that the discourse's affirmation that the people are responsible for paying the debt, and instead focusing on what are the results of all these death-dealing politics, because debt, as Shariana had mentioned, another thing is life after slavery is something that all of these issues are connected. And so this was one of our first challenges when we started doing our political work, to be able to generate a discussion of really where is the debt coming from, and to show how it's directly connected to our colonial situation, and who are those of us who suffer the impact of this debt, and the need, above all, to challenge the narrative, an institutional narrative, that the people have the obligation to pay it. And so to mention a couple examples of how we did this work, how we challenged the state and how we confronted capital here, I'm going to give you some of the workshops that we've done, and I'll show you some pictures about them too. So this state of emergency that Shariana mentioned, and just to explain to you briefly, for people who don't know what is the state of emergency, this was a workshop that we did in 2018, in which we talked about the topic of gender-based violence. And one of our objectives for this workshop was to be able to create discussion, again, about the link between gender-based violence with the responsibility and the inaction of the state and the ways in which state policies really perpetuate and sustain the conditions of violence that women here live, women, our families, and people in the LGBTI community. And this has been a challenge really to work on it, because historically, gender-based violence has been worked on as a topic between individuals, a problem of values between men and women, a situation of inequality, but we have invisibilized totally that gender-based violence has its roots in the capitalist system and anti-Black violence. And that's what we wanted to, that's the discussion that we wanted to have with this workshop. And to be able to make visible how the state contributes and has contributed to gender-based violence. And what we did, and this is where the exercise was, this is the exercise of subverting the logics of power. We took on that symbolism and challenged So in Puerto Rico, as in many other countries, our government officials have the legal capacity to give executive orders. And so for the state of emergency, we declare that there was a state of emergency around gender-based violence. And in our organization, in our movement, we drafted an executive order where we detailed the actions that we demanded that the government adopt in order to eradicate this gender-based violence. And we did this workshop on the struggle that we called the feminist campaign. And we went to the governor's house asking him to sign this executive order that we had drafted. And so this was the first, it didn't really resonate much, but as the days went on, as we were there was discussion about how we had concrete demands for this state of emergency. So we generated enough pressure that in the following years, from 2018 to 2021 and today, the governor and the next governor felt obligated to meet our organization to adopt the demands that we had presented. And this exercise of the state of emergency, so really playing on state of emergency in terms of natural disasters. And we said that there was a state of emergency about gender-based violence, and this ended up being an exercise that brought thousands and thousands of women together in the street in an innumerable amount of protests. And I think that each time the group grew, the number of people that became part of this group grew far beyond feminist organizations because they heard our demands.
Que se sentían particularmente identificadas, y eso generó una presión.
And this generated enough pressure that not only has been sustained through the last 4 years, a permanent discourse of gender-based violence, but it's also brought feminist organizations out into the street, not only for issues of gender-based violence, but against racial violence. It's brought them out to protest state corruption. And this has been the effect of this methodology of direct confrontation to capital and the state. One last example, because I see that I'm running out of time, is the Feminist Embargo. That was another workshop of action that we did, where we made a public call to women to embargo the banks, which has had a principal role in the debt that we have in our country, because these are banks that facilitated lending money. But they're also banks that in the last 10 years have bankrupted thousands of people in this country. And we wanted to make that visible and show this link between capitalism and gender violence and anti-Black violence. So we did a call, don't go to the banks, embargo the banks. And it was like, people can't embargo the banks embargo us. But we just wanted to do this exercise of subverting power. We wanted to take this power for ourselves, and through this performance, we wanted to also show the role that capital and the banks have in the precarious situation that we live in our country. And this action was very powerful, because it was fed by and nurtured by the indignation of so many women who went to these protests in front of the banks, and their families had been, had their homes taken away, had been declared bankrupt, because they felt indignant to show the connection between the policies of austerity and these banks in our reality. And we really had some material wins here, because these banks closed during the time that we were protesting. And this exercise of the state of emergency and this action of feminist embargo have been exercises that haven't necessarily eradicated systems of oppression. Like, we know that this hasn't been our impact yet, but definitively they're part of a process that have shown us what is possible when we really recognize our power and when we confront that which for us means death. And so, a little to wrap up, and I'll show you some of the pictures. I wanted to speak a little bit about radical hope. And maybe to just share with you a little bit about what our vision is for radical hope and how we practice it. Because one, Nelson suggested that we talk about this. And second, because it's an essential part of our work. Because when you're born and live and grow up in a colony where everything is violence, daily violence, you have to hang on to something to be able to eradicate that which wants to kill you. And so that's what radical hope is. It's the forefront of our tools. And what we mean by that is it's an exercise of discipline. It's not necessarily something that comes by osmosis. Radical hope is not something that comes to us because we have a concrete vision of our end goal, but it's recognizing that the conditions that we live in are unjust, and recognizing that others like us live in these unjust conditions, and the desire to change it all. And so when I talked to you about this women's strike that was the beginning of our whole feminist movement in Puerto Rico, and I wanted to tell you about how this started, how it began that day. I told you before that nobody believed that we women could stop the functioning of the country, and nobody bet on this action. But we understood that somebody had to organize it. Somebody had to do it. And this in itself was an action of radical hope. Not necessarily because one thought, I'm going to do it because people will come, but rather I'm going to do it despite people coming. And at this moment, our companions woke up super early. They got there at 4 a.m. to see if anybody would come, to see if any of the invited companions would come. And there were two of us who were waiting in the meetup spot. And they asked each other if really people are going to come, if really this action was going to be possible. And it was possible. And to believe that it's going to be possible is this exercise of hope that has defined our work through the years. In those times, I wasn't part of the feminist collective. I wasn't there. I wasn't organized. And this women's strike, I went and participated and observed, and I saw that this call of these women who were so wholly proclaiming themselves against the system was the call that I received, and that has me here with you guys talking about the work that I do with them from 2017 when I decided to become part of the collective. And so this is the anchor of our radical hope, this call that we can make, and the hope that there are people who will hear the call, and that it'll be us together with those who have been and those who will come in the future, to be able to eradicate this capitalist system that is so violent and that means death for us. So before ending, I told you I would share some pictures. And so I think Carlos is going to share them for me, and we'll just go through them together. I know I went over my time. So this image that I'm showing you here was from an activity that was a march of women that we celebrated in 2019. And this activity was in the framework of the state of emergency action. And the message of this activity we walked from the place where we met up until we walked up to the fort, which is the mansion of the governor, and we asked him to accept this state of emergency declaration, and that we were going to walk as far as we had to walk, so for the situation that we lived in to be recognized, and for the state to adopt these measures that we demanded. And so this image is from our march. We have some children who were participating with their parents. It was a multi-sector act. And this other image that we're seeing is a very important image too. This is one of the activities that we also did in the framework of the state of emergency action. You can see that we're congregated outside of a cemetery. This cemetery is the capital city cemetery, where the mansion of the governor is right there and the legislature is right there. And we marched from the cemetery to the house of the governor. And the message that we carried, and the reason we started at the cemetery, is to confront the death-dealing policies and all the death-dealing policies that gender-based violence uses. And we oppose ourselves to those and confront them. And that's why we used this symbolism of starting from the cemetery, really exemplifying death, which is the end of this system for us. And so getting out of there, starting from there, from the cemetery, and going out to the world and to society, the society that we want. This image that we see here is the day that we did the feminist manifestation. It was the first activity that we did for the state of emergency. And so you see our two companions here, Shariana is one of them. And then the sheet with the demands on it. And so we have many images like this. A lot of these images in our protests have been very important, because when we talk about this confrontation to power, we're not speaking only as a metaphor. It's not just a metaphor for us. In our protests, this confrontation happens. And in many of these protests, the police of Puerto Rico have been a presence. They've always been present to contain us. And so the majority of our protests have a very visible element of confrontation with the state, between women and the state. And so we here have other images from the same protest. And this image was from an Afrofuturist activity that we did. And this is the legislature, the Capitol, where our senators and representatives are, and they approve laws here. And so we went up towards the Capitol with this banner that reads with one of our mottos, not one step backwards. And this last image, which you see here, is part of this practice of radical hope, that we are always inviting people to join with our struggle, to be part of giving more air to our hope. And so we displayed this banner that says, better times will come, we are building them. And that's to indicate that for better times to come, we have to build them. And so I don't know if there were other images. This is more about the feminist embargo that we did. This is one of the banks that we protested, the Santander Bank. And so we put a foreclosure notice on the bank. And so these are members of families whose houses have been embargoed by the bank or who have been foreclosed by the bank. And so this image that you have here is the foreclosure notice that we put up. And this other image that you can see here is also from the embargo activity, the foreclosure activity. And so I'll end my talking here because I want to share with you a quote. We really love music. It's part of the way we situate ourselves and form ourselves. We find our formation not only in books, but in music also. And I wanted to share you a quote from a song of you, Scott Harold. It says,
is that the songs that I sing are just pieces of a dream that I've been building. And we can make a stand and hey, I'm reaching for your hand because I know damn well we can if we are willing, but we gotta be willing. Así que nuestro trabajo se enmarca.
So our work has been framed by understanding that our life and what we do are pieces of the dreams of other worlds that we want to construct. But we know that to achieve them, we have to be willing, like the song says. Thank you. Thank you, Soan, Sariana, Nelson.
We invite the audience, if you want to share some questions, you can post it in the chat. Si quieren incluir quienes siguen esta sesión en el chat algunas de sus preguntas y comentarios, por favor, para nuestros invitados, háganlo ahora, que tenemos unos minutos para conversar con ellas. Por lo pronto, o quizás para dar tiempo a que se escriban estos comentarios o preguntas, sí me gustaría a mí iniciar un poco la conversación. Me llamó
So
mucho.
maybe to give you some time to form your questions, I'd like to start the conversation. I'm really grateful for the clarity on moving from colonial narratives to what Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui in Bolivia calls not a decolonial way of thinking, but an anti-colonial way of thinking. Shariana, you said something about going from ideals to strategies, tactics, and political organization. In your experience, I'd like to start the conversation in this way. How have you guys shown in some performances or in public plazas but also within the communities. How is it that you give way for this political process that you all are the protagonists of? That is patriarchy and the cultural machismo of Latin American and Caribbean cultures. That's such a historic weight. So how do you, within the communities, not only in your public actions, but within the communities that you work with, how do you start working on these strategies? You were talking about that, but I'd like to hear a little bit more. Thank you.
Okay. Bueno, pues, sí. Bueno, inicio diciendo que somos
So I'll start by saying that we're all part of a community. And I think that certain practices or more hegemonic practices of doing political work, and called that way, kind of square ways of doing political work, comes from the traditional ways of doing political work have given communities ways of resisting, and we insert ourselves in these traditions of, and we work with universities and student movements and kind of the lefty, socialist, independent movements in the country. This idea of communities, we tend to perceive it or to name like the community is somewhere where you go to do your work, where you go deposit your work, and not recognizing the ways that we live our social life in community. So in our case, maybe the most flashy thing about the political work we do is what you see in the protests and in our manifestations when we're working against the state. Something that Son mentioned are these formation schools, political formation schools, spaces for conversation and encounter. During the pandemic, we have generated an action that we've named Brigades for Life, where we've been working and betting on mutual aid in different geographic areas. So in the case of Puerto Rico, and in our context, in our community of Barrio Obrero, which is a community that's historically Black, of free Black populations, working class people, and there's a large immigrant population, especially from the Dominican Republic. And it's been a working class, it's been in Barrio Obrero, where maybe 2 years ago, maybe that last year, we did a feminist quilombo in one of the public plazas there. We had a cultural activity, but there was also an element of mutual aid. Last year, we did an activity that we did this twice. The first was responding to the pandemic and the inaction on the part of the state and the real terrible management of the pandemic as we did one first action, Brigade for Life, in poor neighborhoods, and then we did another Brigade for Life for sexual and reproductive rights, for supporting in a collective way maternity, desired maternity. So the organization of our bases and the organization of spaces where we can be with others, together with others, has been something that we've given a lot of importance to. And you know, creating spaces for encounter. And in these spaces for encounter, people can learn about what the reality is or what the possibility of other realities that they hadn't known before. And that's part of the exercise of building collective power and popular collective power. So that's how we see ourselves to be part of the community after Hurricane Maria. Part of our political work in those months afterwards was redirected to a particular emergency, people without electricity, without water, without food. The precarity or the precarization that the government affected. And then we had the earthquakes in 2020. We've generated brigades of mutual aid where we help provide materials, resources, and put people into contact with each other where we know that there are needs or where we know that there are resources, and we help be vehicles and bridges. In 2017, we occupied an abandoned building in Rio Piedras, where we established what at that time we called the Casa Tomada, which was a project work that we worked together with in a community there in Rio Piedras. And this taking over, this occupation of the building helped us to have like a command center to identify where resources were and to have like a popular space and to reestablish a little bit some electricity and water in that space. So in a certain way, our focus when we are working on building other possible ways of living, sometimes the situations put us in confrontation with the state, and sometimes without the state, and sometimes identifying public policies or putting public policies into place that require the collaboration of the state. So different political goals that we've had in our collective kind of dictate what kind of strategies or what kind of practices are going to be necessary that will allow us to fulfill our objectives. So if there's a need for food, we've got to figure out how to fix it. And we've got to figure out the ways that we can fix it. And that's kind of what guides or has served as a compass for our thinking and for us establish. So yeah, we need to establish clearly what our objectives are and then how we can achieve them. So if it's one thing, then we get really agitated, we work in our social networks, but then sometimes there's also work that's giving out pamphlets. I mean, there's different, that's been some of our experience. Communication, music, images, creativity, mutual aid, those are some of our practices.
I would like to address a question to you, Nelson, please. Probably we could switch to English. About the internal colonialism, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui in Bolivia, she talks about how important it is also to decolonize ourselves in some way. And according to your first presentation, Puerto Rican culture is a very important place, probably a strategic place, because of the multicultural diversity you are facing and you are struggling with, to think about that, what it means to decolonize the internal colonialism that we have received for centuries. Would you have some thoughts about that, Nelson?
Yes, and now I sound off speaking with my Puerto Rican Spanish when I could be speaking with my beautiful Castilian Puerto Rican.
You can use both.
But let's go, yeah. Well, I should say that actually, Carlos, when you raise Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui's distinction between decolonial and anti-colonial, first thought that I had in mind was that, well, this is the idea that the colonial somehow does not include anti-colonial is part of this is part of the unfortunate process through which the decolonial has been commodified, made into an academic artifact, and seemingly separated from struggles on the ground. And then it becomes like post-colonial studies, and now you have decolonial studies and so on. So of course, someone who is more on the ground, you look at it and said, well, clearly, we need anti-colonialism. But when you look at how the discourse around decoloniality emerged, was very much linked to struggles from the ground. It cannot be separate. It cannot be separated from this. And included everything in a struggle at the political, epistemic, cultural levels, and so on. There were impressive amount of diversity of actors in the emergence of the colonial, what is known today as the colonial thinking. So it actually, that relationship with, opposition to colonialism in many forms is if not the very first step. And so for me, decolonial actually go back to Fanon when referring to the notion of decolonization. Decolonization and decolonization is not something only against something. In that sense, I would say it's not only anti-colonial, it's not only against something, but it's also the start of a process of undoing something, even in oneself, right? even the colonial apparatus in oneself as well. And by coming together with others, in the process of engaging the presence of coloniality, including in oneself, one can begin to develop, to gradually become a different, better self, right? In that process, to decolonize subjectivity. But this is done as part of a process with others, right? It's not done simply by reading, it is done in a process of really articulating oneself with others who are themselves involved in these multiple struggles, right? It's not simply other academics to do a reading group and these are my others, right? It's really with others in these different struggles, and particularly those generating the more creative ideas and projects and so on, like the Colectiva. So, for example, here I would say that everything that you have seen and heard from La Colectiva offers, among other groups that one can also identify, but I think La Colectiva has been so also, they have done this so remarkably well, I think. Everything all of that they have shared with us also becomes a condition of possibility and opportunity for others to enter in a process of walking with, acompañamiento, potentially collaboration. And in that process of getting involved, they can engage in that process of self-decolonization too. Right? So all of these are activities that in many cases confront the state frontally, but also are opportunities to be part of a process that identifies terms, tools, methodologies, and concepts that generate self-decolonization. So if you are involved in the process, you can do it. So in that sense, this is for me that's how I shift from the colonial, not to the anti-colonial. Of course, I support the anti-colonial, that's a given, but to this notion of decolonial combativity or decolonial combativity, because this same decolonial then is articulated really with different struggles and us putting our time, our resources, our abilities to facilitate, further potentiate these struggles, not only from the outside, but when the opportunity appears organically, then you suddenly find yourself in a different position, right? Like Sharina was saying that, well, when organically the organization can find itself providing certain kind of support for communities in need, but then in another juncture, the organization finds itself, fulfilling another role. And that's part of the rhythm of the struggle. So that's what I would say. And that's why all of this is so fundamental, not only, let's say, to think about, in terms of political theory or activism, but also in terms of self-decolonization.
Gracias, Nelson. Hay una pregunta en español que quisiera plantear a las compañeras.
Thank you, Nelson. There's a question in Spanish that I'd like to ask our companions here. Have you received any sort of support or solidarity from churches or religious groups in your struggle, in your movement? I don't know, Shariana or Soan, if you'd like to share. And then we'll do another question in English that Matt will present. Well, I think that I can mention the dialogue. Our companion Yaeli here is from the Mesa Martin Luther King, who has been supporting our organization. We've shared discussion space with them, so I can mention that we've had some dialogue with I don't know if Shariana knows of another group, but I wanted to mention our dialogue companions.
Okay, sí, es que no me podía unmute.
I couldn't unmute myself. I just wanted to add that the organizing meeting of the Feminist Quilombo action that we did happened in the Lutheran Church. Like they lent us the space within the Lutheran Church in order to organize, to have our meeting, to organize. And that was on like November 25th. We had a long meeting that included civil disobedience. We had that meeting in the Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Santurce. And so even though here in Puerto Rico, religious fundamentalism is very strong, certainly the policies and the strategies of our organization have conflict with certain ideological practices. Even though that's true, there are spaces and organizations that are religious or faith-based that haven't only opened their doors of their churches to us for us to use the space as meeting spaces and formation spaces, but they've also joined, some people have joined in our process. So we have that dynamic. It's less, we would like that to be stronger, but that's where it's at right now. And so before hearing the question in English, I just want to say, Shariana and Soan, that the idea of a feminist quilombo is really makes me feel a lot. That's a great idea. A Brazilian companion of who will be present with us in April, in the session that we'll have in April. She'll speak about quilombism, which is about Black epistemology in Brazil that is developing with a lot of creativity and has such a political dimension. So quilombism is a symbol of the resistance, something maybe beyond combative decoloniality. And so we'll have them with us in March.
Yes, so this question comes from Professor Andrew Prevost. He asks, could you say more about combating anti-Black racism in Puerto Rico? How does the history of racial mixture and blanqueamiento complicate this struggle?
Yo puedo contestar. Bueno,
so I can answer this. Definitely, it complicates things quite a bit. To give you some context, here in Puerto Rico, there's our identity as Puerto Ricans is anchored in the affirmation that we're a mix of three races, a mix of equal parts Spanish, indigenous, and African peoples. And so in that way of understanding, they tell us that it was like a harmony, a very peaceful mix of races. And so if that complicates our struggle, I think that framework, what it does is eliminate and invisibilize first how this mixture actually happened and the violence that caused it here in Puerto Rico and in other places. As far as the treatment of enslaved people, here in Puerto Rico, indigenous people were eliminated. It wasn't a harmonic mix of races. And definitively, Black people were not only dragged from their places of origin, but that's our true history. But that's not how we're taught. And it's not the way it's talked about. And what it invisibilizes, the violence against anti-Black protests in our country is also invisibilized. So the topic of anti-Black violence is something that's become part of our work. And to tell you an anecdote, maybe like a year and a half ago, we did a protest in which we used the assassination of George Floyd to protest how anti-Black violence is lived in Puerto Rico. And part of the things that we confronted when we were organizing this protest is that people said to us, in Puerto Rico, there's no racism. This doesn't exist. Why are we protesting? How can you say there's racism in this country when we're all people of color, when we're all mixed, when we're just a mix of races, and there's not so much difference. Nevertheless, this idea is the idea that we're trying to combat, saying that not only here in Puerto Rico do the police also assassinate Black people, there's conflict between Black communities and that Black communities live a particular kind of violence that the state is directly implicated in. So one of these protests of anti-Black violence is when where are factories that make agrotoxins built? Where do they put them? It's in Black communities. And that's something that we need to, it's a manifestation of racism. It's called environmental racism. And so to answer your question, definitely this idea of what our identity is makes it really difficult, even for our own people can recognize and know ourselves and recognize the violence that we live in this country and where it comes from. Because there's this whole idea that racism doesn't exist because here we're a mix. So, yeah, I think that through our political work, not only in protests, but in our dialogue spaces, it's a topic that we work on. And it really requires a lot of talk for us to continue to fully understand this whole historical framework and to understand how it works. So yeah, that's I don't know if Shariana wants to add something. I think the only thing I would add to what you bring, Son, is that there's a denial of the racial state where they've substituted white colonial, they've substituted the white colonist with the Puerto Rican. So this transition is like the re-signification of this coloniality of power. Puerto Rican continues to be and continues to have the same configuration as a subject, as a historic subject, as a political subject, and as a receiver of rights. And so within this imagined subject of the male Puerto Rican, they're assumed to be white, and this invisibilizes, as Soan mentioned, and reproduces anti-Black violence that still permeates and persists in the current day. And so that's why I also refer to what I had said at the beginning about how race continues to operate in 3 different times and at the same time, under the notion and the Puerto Rican we could say the Mexican, the Venezuelan, the Argentine, it doesn't matter. This idea of a national subject is part of our shared history. This subject of the nation continues to reproduce a racialized anti-Black state where this zone of non-being, and those of us who are not and will never be because we never were, is part of the reproduction. I would say not only, it doesn't only complicate and make it very difficult to establish projects of collective liberation, because there's still a colonial relationship with the US. So with our current colonizer, nobody in our colony is a white subject, is what they say. But we know that here in the interior of our territory, the notion of whiteness is a floating signifier, as Stuart Hall teaches us. And for those of us who study racialized thinking, that's all I would add.
Gracias, Shariana. So a last question, very briefly, because we have very few minutes left, about the radical hope, sobre la esperanza radical. Ha sido una expresión que han comentado aquí en el chat y que nos deja a todos con hambre para conocer un poco más sobre su idea, su experiencia, su narrativa de esperanza radical. Could you say something in Spanish or English, please?
Ay, ok, ya me quita el mute. Bueno, aprovechar el espacio para decir que si les interesa tener otras discusiones con nosotras sobre la esperanza radical,
I'll maybe use this space to say that if you want to hear more from us about radical hope, you can come to our next formation school. It's a political school that's open to the public. Members of our collective participate, but we also open the space to the public so that we can have more participation. And so we invite you to be there through social media. You can find more information about it because we do these on Zoom. And so to just briefly answer your question, I think, as I mentioned before, we see radical hope as a practice. And our practice is anchored in a kind of militant, constant, committed, directed practice about doing what we have to do, doing what needs to be done, about starting with no guarantees, to do what we need to do with the resources that we have and with the people that are ready to do it, to struggle to eradicate these systems of oppression using the tactics that we think are possible. We know that we need many different strategies to eradicate the capitalist system. It's not that we're part of a giant movement. We assume a methodology or a strategy that confronts the state to reveal how the system works, but we know that there's other strategies that are necessary. But for us, our hope is fed by these spaces and these moments where we come together with others to struggle against the system. When this is something I wanted to mention just now, and I didn't say it, there's a quote. Audre Lorde is one of our teachers, and I want to share with you one of her quotes that's one thing that power does to perpetuate itself is to take away from popular culture everything that can give it energy to eradicate the system. And one of the first things, and clearly this is part of coloniality, is that power, what it does is it doesn't allow us to see each other. It doesn't allow us to recognize each other, and it doesn't allow us to recognize above everything these spaces, the conditions that we live in that are so similar, and the roots of these conditions, the problem, and how all of us are required to come together with different strategies to be able to attack this which is causing us so much violence. And in this sense, and this is where I'm going to mention another comment from the chat about what other strategies work, I think Black feminism, an important thing that it teaches us is that not only do we have to transform institutions and the society, but part of the work that we have to do to undo systems of oppression is that we have to transform ourselves. And this is something that requires work and requires conflict and requires seeing ourselves and recognizing ourselves. And I think that there's not a whole scheme of like how to explain or define radical hope, but there's certainly the most important element is encounter. And the encounter that we have in these spaces with our common objective of better life with others. Thank you very much, Soan and Shariana Nelson, for sharing your knowledge with us today, your delicious knowledge and your struggles of combative decoloniality, your radical hope that I think we might call spiritualities and resistance that animate you to resist with dignity and loving hope this globalized violence that we can only dismantle from within, sharing our knowledge with each other and practices for well-being and dignified life. We also
on Friday, February 25th, at the same time for the second session of this seminar. Our guest next month will be Daniela Rea, one of the most creative investigative journalists in Mexico, accompanying relatives of disappeared persons to tell the stories of those communities. Following this decolonial methodology, we will listen to relatives of disappeared persons to tell us their experience and analyze together the systemic violence that is destroying the lives of thousands of people, missing people, disappeared persons around the world. Hay esperanza, esperanza radical. Hace 10 años o más, en Chile comenzó un movimiento con unas jóvenes estudiantes protestando por los injustos precios del transporte. Y 10 años después hay una...
And 10 years later, there's a radical change in the Chilean people, constitutional Congress, a new president. We hope that there is a path there for other Caribbean and Latin American peoples.
Soon news about the second session by email. Good afternoon, everybody. See you in a month's time. Pronto recibirán todas noticias sobre la
You will soon receive this news about our second session, and we'll see you in a month. Thank you very much.
Ciao. Thank you.